In the sprawling cosmos, where a single galactic credit could mean the difference between a warm meal and starvation, humanity had earned a reputation that made even the most hardened alien traders nervous. They called us the bleeding hearts of the galaxy, a species so irrationally compassionate that we'd give our last breath to save a stranger. Most civilizations saw this as a fatal weakness, a genetic flaw that would surely lead to our extinction. They were wrong. What they didn't understand was that this very weakness would become humanity's greatest strength, forging bonds that would reshape the political landscape of 12-star systems and prove that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can topple empires. This is the story of Dr. Sarah Chun, a broke xenobiologist with exactly 5 credits to her name, who made a choice that would echo across the stars and reveal why the galaxy's most ruthless predators had learned to fear human compassion. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the grimy scanner at the spaceport entrance, watching her credit balance flash on the cracked display. 5 credits. 5 measly credits stood between her and complete destitution on Kepler Station, a lawless trading hub floating in the void between civilized space and the dangerous frontier worlds. The scanner beeped mockingly, and Sarah pulled her hand away, stuffing it deep into the pocket of her worn lab coat. 3 months ago, she had been Dr. Sarah Chun, respected xenobiologist at the prestigious Terran Research Institute. Today, she was just another broke human trying to survive in a galaxy that seemed determined to grind her species into cosmic dust. The fall had been swift and merciless. Her research grant had been revoked after she published a paper suggesting that the Zephyrian Empire's treatment of indigenous species constituted genocide. The academic community, terrified of losing Zephyrian funding, had turned their backs on her overnight. Her colleagues whispered that she should have kept her mouth shut, should have focused on safe, profitable research instead of stirring up political trouble. But Sarah couldn't ignore what she had seen during her survey mission to Zephyr 7. Entire ecosystems bulldozed for mining operations. Native species rounded up and shipped off-world as exotic pets or forced labor. Children separated from their families and sold to the highest bidder. The images haunted her dreams and made her stomach churn every time she thought about the scientific community's complicit silence. Now she wandered through Kepler Station's lower levels, past the flickering neon signs advertising everything from illegal cybernetic modifications to off-world passage for those desperate enough to risk the uncharted sectors. The air recyclers wheezed overhead, struggling to process the mixture of alien pheromones, industrial chemicals, and desperation that seemed to permeate every corner of the station. Sarah paused at a food vendor, a 3-armed Calaxian whose purple skin gleamed with perspiration as he worked over a series of bubbling pots. The smell of spice protein made her empty stomach clench painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving on water and the occasional energy tablet scavenged from abandoned research stations. Fresh Nerf steaks, the vendor called out in heavily accented Standard Galactic. Only 15 credits. Good for human digestion, yes. 15 credits. 3 times her entire net worth. Sarah forced a smile and shook her head, continuing past the disappointed vendor. Around her, the station's diverse population went about their business with the casual efficiency of those accustomed to surviving on the margins of galactic civilization. Insectoid Threx clicked their mandibles in rapid conversation, while massive, bear-like Ursinoids lumber through the corridors with surprising grace. This was humanity's reality in the year 2387. Despite their technological achievements and expansion across dozens of star systems, humans remained the galaxy's perpetual underdogs. They lacked the Zephyrians' military might, the Crystalline Collective's economic dominance, or the Void Dancer's mastery of faster-than-light travel. What humans did have was a stubborn refusal to abandon their principles, even when those principles led them into poverty and exile. Sarah's wandering brought her to the station's industrial sector, where the constant hum of machinery provided a steady backdrop to the more unsavory aspects of frontier life. It was here, in the shadow of a massive atmosphere processor, that she heard the sound that would change everything. A weak, pitiful whimpering echoed from behind a stack of cargo containers marked with Zephyrian military insignia. Sarah's scientific training kicked in automatically, and she found herself moving toward the sound despite every survival instinct screaming at her to mind her own business. Getting involved with Zephyrian military cargo was a fast way to end up spaced without a suit. But the sound was so small, so desperate, that her feet seemed to move of their own accord. Behind the containers, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, Sarah discovered a small cage constructed from some kind of energy-conducting metal. Inside, barely larger than her fist, lay what appeared to be a dying alien creature. Its fur was a deep midnight blue, almost black, and its tiny chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of imminent death. Sarah knelt beside the cage, her xenobiologist training automatically cataloging the creature's features. The body structure suggested it was a juvenile of some kind, possibly a mammalian species given the fur and what appeared to be specialized milk teeth. But the bone structure was unlike anything in her extensive database of known species. More concerning were the obvious signs of abuse and neglect. The creature's fur was matted with its own waste, and angry red welts crisscrossed its tiny body. A metal collar around its neck bore Zephyrian text that Sarah's universal translator struggled to parse. Finally, settling on something that roughly translated to property of Military Research Division, specimen 7749. The creature's eyes fluttered open as Sarah leaned closer, and she found herself staring into pools of liquid silver that seemed to hold an intelligence far beyond what should be possible in something so young. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw recognition there, as if the tiny being understood exactly what was happening to it. "Oh, you poor little thing," Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "What have they done to you?" The creature tried to lift its head, managing only to shift slightly toward the sound of her voice. One tiny paw pressed against the energy bars of its cage, and Sarah noticed that the creature's digits were longer and more dexterous than they had first appeared. This was clearly a sapient species, not some mindless animal to be experimented upon. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her portable scanner, a piece of equipment she had somehow managed to hold on to through all her recent troubles. The device hummed to life, its blue light playing over the creature's tiny form as it gathered biological data. What she saw in the readout made her blood run cold. The creature was dying, that much was immediately obvious. Its life signs were failing across the board, blood pressure dropping, neural activity decreasing, cellular regeneration at near zero levels. But worse than the physical decline was the psychological profile the scanner provided. The creature was experiencing levels of stress and trauma that would have killed most species outright. It was holding on through sheer force of will, driven by some deep survival instinct that refused to surrender even in the face of certain death. But there was something else, something that made Sarah's scientific mind race with possibilities. The creature's neural patterns showed evidence of rapid adaptation and learning, as if its brain was constantly evolving to cope with new stimuli. This wasn't just another victim of Zephyrian military research. This was potentially a member of a species with intellectual capabilities that might rival or even exceed human norms. The cage's lock was a standard Zephyrian military design, the kind that could be opened with the right access codes or a substantial bribe to the guards. Sarah checked her credit balance again, knowing what she would find, but hoping against hope that she had miscounted. 5 credits. Barely enough for a single meal, let alone the kind of bribe that would convince a Zephyrian guard to look the other way while she liberated military property. But as she stared into those silver eyes, watching the light slowly fade as the creature's strength ebbed away, Sarah found her decision had already been made. Her grandmother had always said that you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who couldn't fight back. By that measure, the Zephyrian Empire had revealed its true nature through its treatment of this helpless creature, and Sarah would reveal hers through what she did next. She stood up, brushing dust off her knees, and began looking for a guard station or automated vendor that might have emergency medical supplies. The creature needed immediate intervention if it was going to survive the next hour, let alone long enough for her to figure out how to free it from its cage. Her 5 credits might not be enough to bribe a guard, but they might buy the medical supplies necessary to stabilize the creature until she could come up with a better plan. 3 levels up, Sarah found what she was looking for, an automated medical supply dispenser servicing the station's emergency response teams. The machine's interface flickered to life as she approached, displaying a menu of available supplies in Standard Galactic. Basic medical scanners, antiseptic compounds, synthetic blood substitutes, neural stimulants, everything a field medic might need to save a life. Sarah's finger hovered over the neural stimulant option. 5 credits exactly. It was a powerful drug designed to jumpstart failing biological systems, potentially buying the creature enough time for its natural healing processes to engage. But using it would leave her completely broke, with no resources left to secure food, shelter, or passage off the station. She thought about her grandmother again, about the stories of old Earth where humans had risked everything to save species on the verge of extinction. About the way her grandmother's eyes had lit up when she talked about the conservation efforts that had brought wolves and elephants back from the brink. About the pride in her voice when she spoke of humanity's greatest accomplishment. Not their technology or their expansion across the stars, but their unwillingness to let others suffer when they had the power to help. Sarah pressed the neural stimulant option and placed her palm against the payment scanner. The machine hummed thoughtfully for a moment, processing the transaction, then dispensed a small vial filled with luminescent blue liquid. Her credit balance flashed 0, and the scanner's cheerful confirmation tone seemed to mock the magnitude of what she had just done. But as she hurried back toward the industrial sector, clutching the vial that represented her last hope for survival on the station, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. For the first time since her exile from the scientific community, she was doing exactly what she was meant to do, using her knowledge and resources to preserve life, regardless of the personal cost. The creature was weaker when she returned, its breathing so shallow that she could barely detect the rise and fall of its tiny chest. Its eyes had closed, and its silver fur seemed to have lost some of its luster. Sarah worked quickly, using her portable scanner to calculate the proper dosage of neural stimulant for the creature's body mass and species parameters. Too little would be ineffective. Too much could cause permanent neurological damage or death. The energy cage's bars were spaced just far enough apart for her to slip the injection stylus through. Sarah held her breath as she administered the drug, watching the scanner's readouts as the neural stimulant spread through the creature's system. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the creature's vital signs began to stabilize. Its breathing deepened, and a faint tremor ran through its small body as cellular regeneration processes slowly came back online. The creature's eyes opened, and this time Sarah was certain she saw intelligence there, not just animal awareness, but genuine recognition of what had just happened. One tiny paw pressed against the energy bars again, and Sarah could have sworn she heard a sound that might have been gratitude. "That's it, little one," she whispered, tears she hadn't realized were falling, blurring her vision. "Fight back. Show them what you're made of." But even as relief flooded through her at seeing the creature stabilize, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The neural stimulant would buy them time, but it wouldn't heal the creature's injuries or free it from its cage. And now she was completely broke, with no resources left to continue helping the small being that had somehow become the most important thing in her universe. As if summoned by her thoughts, heavy footsteps echoed through the industrial sector. Sarah quickly pocketed her scanner and stepped back from the cage, trying to look like any other station resident going about their business. But her heart hammered against her ribs as 2 Zephyrian guards rounded the corner, their imposing 7-foot frames encased in powered armor that gleamed under the emergency lighting. Inspection time, one of them rumbled in the deep, resonant voice characteristic of their species. "Command wants to verify the cargo before transport." Sarah forced herself to walk away, casually, as if she had merely been taking a shortcut through the industrial sector. Behind her, she could hear the guards activating their scanning equipment, running routine checks on their valuable cargo. In a few hours, that cargo would include the small creature she had just saved, loaded onto a transport bound for some Zephyrian research facility where unspeakable experiments waited, unless she could find a way to stop it. As Sarah disappeared into the maze of the station's lower levels, her mind was already working on the problem. She had no money, no resources, and no allies. But she had something the Zephyrian Empire had consistently underestimated in their dealings with humanity: an absolute refusal to abandon those who needed help, even when logic dictated that the cause was hopeless. The creature was alive because of her intervention. Now she needed to make sure it stayed that way. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like her grandmother whispered that this moment, this choice to spend her last credits on a dying alien creature, would prove to be the most important decision of her life. Not just for her, but for the future of human-alien relations across the galaxy. She just had to live long enough to see it through. Sarah spent the next 6 hours in the station's public data terminals, using her xenobiologist credentials to access research databases and piece together information about the creature she had saved. What she discovered made her stomach turn and her resolve harden into something approaching steel. The species was called the Kythera, and they were refugees. 3 months ago, the Zephyrian Empire had invaded their homeworld of HFY, claiming it as a military staging ground for their expansion into the Outer Rim territories. The invasion had been swift and brutal, with the Zephyrians deploying orbital bombardment to crush any organized resistance before it could form. Official reports claimed the planet had been uninhabited, just another dead rock to be strip-mined for resources. The reports were lies. Sarah's access to classified xenobiological databases revealed the truth that the mainstream media had been paid to suppress. KYTH Prime had been home to nearly 50 million Kythera, a young species that had only achieved spaceflight within the last century. They were scientists and philosophers, artists and dreamers who had built a civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest. Their technology focused on healing and growth rather than weapons of war. It made them easy targets. The few Kythera who survived the initial bombardment were rounded up and classified as valuable biological specimens for military research. Their unique neural plasticity and rapid adaptation abilities made them ideal subject for experiments designed to enhance Zephyrian soldiers' cognitive capabilities. Children were particularly prized because their developing brains showed even greater flexibility. Sarah's hands shook as she read the clinical descriptions of the experiments. Sleep deprivation studies to test mental endurance. Surgical removal of brain tissue to map neural pathways. Injection of experimental drugs to enhance memory formation. The researchers wrote about their subjects with the detached professionalism of scientists studying bacteria cultures, never acknowledging that they were torturing and murdering sapient beings. The creature in the cage, Sarah had started thinking of it as the cub, was one of perhaps 1,000 Kythera juveniles being transported across the galaxy to various research facilities. Each transport was carefully scheduled to avoid human patrol routes, since the Terran Federation had officially protested the Zephyrian expansion into neutral territory. Not that the protests carried much weight when the Federation lacked the military strength to back up their moral objections. But protests and diplomatic channels had failed to save the Kythera. The galactic community had watched in silence as an entire civilization was erased, too intimidated by Zephyrian military might to risk intervention. Only a few independent journalists and rogue researchers had tried to document what was happening, and most of them had mysteriously disappeared or been discredited through carefully orchestrated scandals. Sarah understood now why her research grant had been revoked. Her paper on Zephyrian genocide hadn't just been an academic inconvenience. It had threatened to expose a conspiracy of silence that reached to the highest levels of galactic politics. The same research institutes that claimed to value scientific integrity had sold their souls to maintain access to Zephyrian funding and resources. She was still absorbed in the data when a shadow fell across her terminal. Sarah looked up to find herself face-to-face with Captain Marcus Webb, a grizzled human trader whose reputation preceded him even to the remote corners of Kepler Station. Webb was legendary in independent shipping circles, known for taking contracts that other captains wouldn't touch and somehow always managing to deliver his cargo intact despite impossible odds. Dr. Sarah Chun, Webb said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who had spent decades breathing recycled ship air. Heard you were asking questions about Zephyrian transport schedules. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the terminal's privacy screen, but Webb held up a weathered hand to stop her. Easy there, Doc. I'm not working for the lizards. Webb's use of the derogatory term for Zephyrians marked him as someone who had no love for the Empire. Fact is, I've been watching you for the last few hours, wondering if you might be the answer to a problem I've been wrestling with. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah said carefully. On a station like Kepler, paranoia was a survival skill, and Webb's sudden appearance felt too convenient to be coincidental. Webb glanced around the data terminal area, confirming they weren't being observed, then leaned closer. My ship's the Defiant Star, docked at Base 7. Bought her from a resistance cell that got wiped out during the Rigel uprising. She's got some interesting modifications that make her very good at getting into places she shouldn't be. The mention of the resistance sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The anti-Zephyrian underground was real, but it was also dangerous. Getting involved with them was a fast way to end up on an Imperial kill list. Captain Webb, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do, but I'm just a researcher. I don't have any connection to political movements. Maybe not, Webb said, but you've got something I need. Expertise. See, my crew and I have been planning a little operation for the past month. The Zephyrians have a transport leaving tomorrow night, carrying what they call biological specimens to a research facility in the Vega system. We know how to intercept the ship, but we don't know how to keep the specimens alive once we've got them. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. You're talking about hijacking a military transport. Liberating, Webb corrected. And yes, it's dangerous as hell. But sometimes that's what it takes to do the right thing. His eyes hardened as he continued. My daughter was on a colony ship that got relocated during Zephyrian expansion 3 years ago. Never saw her again. So you could say I've got personal reasons for wanting to hurt the Empire wherever I can. The terminal chimed softly, indicating that Sarah's access time was nearly expired. She saved her research data to a secure partition, her mind racing as she processed Webb's offer. It was insane, suicidal, exactly the kind of reckless heroism that had gotten humanity labeled as the galaxy's bleeding hearts. It was also the only chance the Kithera Cub had for survival. What makes you think I'd be willing to participate in something like this? Sarah asked. Webb's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. Because 20 minutes ago you spent your last 5 credits on neural stimulant for a dying alien, then went straight to the research terminals to learn everything you could about its species. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Dr. Chun. Sarah's stomach dropped. You were watching me. I was waiting to see if you'd do the right thing, Webb said. My contact in station security sent me footage of you administering the injection. Figure if you were willing to bankrupt yourself to save one creature, you might be interested in saving a few hundred more. The terminal's access timer hit 0, and the screen went dark. Sarah stood up slowly, acutely aware that the next words out of her mouth would determine the trajectory of her life. She could walk away, try to find passage off the station, maybe start over somewhere the Zephyrians couldn't reach her. It would be the safe choice, the rational choice. But she kept thinking about those silver eyes, about the intelligence and hope she had seen there, about the clinical descriptions of experiments performed on children who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong species at the wrong time, about her grandmother's stories of humans who had risked everything to preserve life in the face of overwhelming darkness. Tell me about your plan, Sarah said. Webb's smile became genuine this time. First, let me introduce you to the rest of my crew. They're going to want to meet the woman who's going to help us pull off the impossible. The Defiant Star was a modified freighter that had seen better decades, her hull scarred from encounters with everything from asteroid fields to plasma cannon fire. But as Webb led Sarah through the ship's corridors, she could see evidence of extensive modifications that went far beyond standard merchant vessel specifications. Reinforced bulkheads, military-grade shield generators, and weapon hardpoints that had been carefully disguised to look like standard cargo handling equipment. The crew was equally impressive. Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez had been a Federation Navy tactical officer before she resigned in protest over the government's failure to intervene in Zephyrian atrocities. Chief Engineer Tommy Nakamura was a technical genius who had been blacklisted from corporate employment after he refused to work on weapons systems designed for population management operations. Dr. James Okafor was a former Terran intelligence analyst whose criticism of Federation foreign policy had earned him a one-way ticket to exile. They were all humans, Sarah realized. All refugees from a system that had asked them to compromise their principles in the name of political expediency. They had chosen exile over complicity, poverty over participation in atrocities. In another galaxy, they might have been celebrated as heroes. Here, they were criminals and outcasts forced to operate on the margins of civilized space. But they were also exactly the kind of people who would risk everything to save strangers. The transport is a Zephyrian heavy cruiser called the Subjugator, Vasquez explained as the crew gathered around a holographic display showing the ship's specifications. She's armed to the teeth and escorted by 2 destroyer-class vessels. Standard merchant interdiction won't work. We need to be surgical about this. Nakamura highlighted several sections of the cruiser's design. The good news is that we know her route and schedule. She'll be passing through the Nebula 7 transit corridor, where sensor interference limits escort effectiveness. The bad news is that we'll have maybe 10 minutes to disable her systems, board, locate the specimens, and extract before the escorts can respond. Sarah studied the holographic display, her scientific training automatically analyzing the tactical challenges. What about life support for the specimens during transport? If they're anything like the creature I treated, they'll be in critical condition. Moving them without proper medical support could kill them as surely as leaving them with the Zephyrians. Dr. Okafor nodded approvingly. That's exactly why we need you, Dr. Chun. We've converted one of our cargo holds into a makeshift medical facility, but we need someone with xenobiological expertise to manage the evacuation and treatment protocols. Can you do it? Sarah looked around the room at these humans who had sacrificed comfortable lives to fight for principles that most of the galaxy considered naive and self-destructive. They were asking her to join them in an operation that would almost certainly result in their deaths or capture. The rational part of her mind cataloged all the reasons why she should refuse, walk away, try to save herself instead of throwing her life away on a hopeless gesture. But then she thought about the cub again, about its silver eyes and the desperate hope she had seen there, about the research data she had discovered, the clinical descriptions of torture disguised as science, about the 50 million Kithara who had died because no one with the power to help them had been willing to act. I'll need detailed biological data on all the specimen types, Sarah said, and access to your medical supplies so I can prepare treatment protocols. How many are we talking about extracting? Webb's grin was fierce and proud. Intelligence suggests approximately 250 Kithara of various ages, plus maybe 50 specimens from other species the Zephyrians have collected. It'll be tight, but the Defiant Star has handled worse odds. Dr. Chun, Vasquez said seriously, I want to make sure you understand what you're committing to. This isn't just grand theft or property destruction. We're talking about an act of war against the Zephyrian Empire. If we're captured, we'll be tortured for information and then executed as terrorists. If we succeed, we'll be fugitives for the rest of our lives. Sarah thought about her comfortable life at the Terran Research Institute, about the colleagues who had turned their backs on her when she tried to expose Zephyrian atrocities, about the academic career she had lost, and the future she had planned that would never come to pass. All of it seemed small and insignificant compared to the opportunity to save hundreds of innocent lives. Commander, Sarah said, using Vasquez's former military rank, I've already lost everything that mattered to my old life. But if we can save those people, maybe I can find something worth living for. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Sarah worked with Dr. Okafor to analyze intelligence data on the transport's cargo manifest, identifying the specific medical needs of each species they would be attempting to rescue. The Kithara made up the majority of the specimens, but there were also members of the pacifist Melodian Collective, several young crystalline collective entities, and even a few humans from colonies that had resisted Zephyrian occupation. Nakamura and his engineering team worked around the clock to modify the cargo hold medical facility, installing specialized life support systems and emergency treatment pods. The ship's existing medical bay was expanded with equipment borrowed from various sources around Kepler Station, much of it acquired through channels that Sarah decided not to inquire about too closely. Meanwhile, Webb and Vasquez refined their tactical approach based on updated intelligence about the transport's escort pattern. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: disable the subjugator's engines and shields using a modified electromagnetic pulse weapon, board through the cargo bays where the specimens were held, evacuate all living cargo, and escape before the escort ships could respond. It was the kind of plan that looked good on paper and had approximately 1,000 ways it could go catastrophically wrong in practice. But as Sarah worked through the medical protocols and treatment schedules, she found herself feeling more alive than she had in months. This was what she had become a xenobiologist to do: preserve life, protect the vulnerable, use science to make the galaxy a better place. The fact that she was doing it outside the law just meant that the law had failed in its fundamental purpose. The night before the operation, as the Defiant Star prepared to leave Kepler Station, Sarah found herself standing in the modified cargo hold that would soon hold hundreds of rescued beings. The medical equipment hummed quietly around her, ready to provide whatever emergency treatment their desperate passengers might need. Supplies were stacked neatly along the bulkheads: nutrient solutions, surgical tools, neural stimulants, everything she had been able to think of to keep the specimens alive during their evacuation. Webb appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled like it had been brewed from recycled engine lubricant. "Second thoughts?" he asked, offering her one of the cups. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, letting its warmth drive away the chill that seemed to have taken permanent residence in her bones. "Constant second thoughts," she admitted, "but also the certainty that this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. That's the human condition in a nutshell," Webb said. "Doubt everything, but do the right thing anyway." He took a sip of the terrible coffee and made a face. Tommy's coffee always tastes like industrial solvent, but it keeps you awake during long hauls. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the quiet preparations for an operation that would either save hundreds of lives or get them all killed. Outside the cargo hold, Sarah could hear the crew making final preparations for departure. Systems checks, course calculations, weapons inspections. "Captain," Sarah said finally, "why are you doing this? I understand wanting revenge against the Zephyrians, but this seems like more than that." Webb was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of pain and determination that made her understand why his crew followed him into impossible situations. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "The Federation won't act. The other major powers won't intervene. The galaxy's bureaucrats and politicians will write strongly worded protests while entire species get wiped out. So it falls to people like us, the exiles, the outcasts, the ones who've lost everything, to do what needs to be done." He turned to meet her eyes, and Sarah saw reflected there the same desperate hope she had seen in the Kithera cub's silver gaze. "My daughter's name was Rachel," Webb continued. "She was studying to be a teacher when the Zephyrians came to her colony. The official report said there were no survivors, but I know better. I've seen the transport manifests, the research requests. She's out there somewhere, in some lab, being used as a test subject for whatever sick experiments they're running this week." Sarah's heart clenched as she understood the depth of Webb's commitment. This wasn't just about principles or abstract morality. It was personal, immediate, desperate. "Captain, I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Nobody knows," Webb said. "That's the point. The Zephyrians are very good at making people disappear without a trace, at covering up their atrocities with bureaucratic language and classified reports. But every time we save someone, every time we pull even one victim out of their clutches, we prove that their system isn't perfect. That resistance is possible." The ship shuddered slightly as the docking clamps disengaged, and the Defiant Star began its departure from Kepler Station. In 12 hours, they would intercept the subjugator and attempt the impossible. Sarah knew that the odds of survival were minimal, that they were probably flying toward their deaths. But as she looked around the medical facility they had built, thinking about the lives they were going to save, she realized that some things were worth dying for. And if humanity's stubborn refusal to abandon the helpless was what the galaxy called a fatal flaw, then she was proud to share that flaw with her species. The Defiant Star jumped to hyperspace, carrying its crew of human outcasts toward a confrontation that would test everything they believed about duty, sacrifice, and the value of life itself. And in a cage in the industrial sector of Kepler Station, a small Kithera cub with silver eyes pressed its paw against the energy bars and somehow sensed that help was coming. The Nebula 7 transit corridor was a maze of ionized gas clouds and electromagnetic interference that made it a smuggler's paradise and a Navy commander's nightmare. Sensor readings became unreliable, communication systems suffered constant static, and navigation required the kind of intuitive piloting that computers couldn't replicate. It was exactly the kind of place where a small, modified freighter might have a chance against military vessels 10 times its size. Sarah stood on the Defiant Star's bridge, watching the swirling purple and gold clouds of the nebula stream past the viewports as Captain Webb maneuvered through the interference field with the casual expertise of someone who had spent decades running contraband through dangerous space. The bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, their movements precise and economical as they prepared for what would either be their greatest triumph or their final battle. "Contact," Lieutenant Commander Vasquez announced from the sensor station. 3 vessels on course 184 Mark 7. Speed consistent with military convoy formation. Looks like our intelligence was accurate. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the tactical display updated to show 3 red icons moving through the nebula on a predictable course toward the Vega system. The subjugator was the largest, a heavy cruiser bristling with weapons and armor designed to discourage exactly the kind of operation they were attempting. Its 2 escort destroyers flanked it in a defensive formation that would make any conventional attack suicidal. But Webb's plan wasn't conventional. It was insane. "Tommy, are the modifications ready?" Webb asked over the intercom. Chief Engineer Nakamura's voice crackled back through the static-laden communication system. "EMP torpedo is armed and ready, Captain. Fair warning, though. Once we fire this thing, we'll have about 30 seconds before the escorts realize what's happening and start shooting at us." Dr. Okafor looked up from his intelligence station. "Thermal scans are showing the cargo bays are fully loaded. I'm reading approximately 300 life signs of various species. They're all alive, but the biopattern suggests severe stress and trauma." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what they were attempting. 300 sentient beings, probably including the Kithera cub she had saved on Kepler Station, all counting on this ramshackle crew of human outcasts to somehow overcome impossible odds and carry them to safety. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it also crystallized her resolve in ways she hadn't expected. "Dr. Chun," Webb said, "you'd better get down to the cargo bay. Once we make our move, things are going to happen very fast." Sarah nodded, taking one last look at the tactical display before heading for the lift. The modified cargo bay had been transformed into something that barely resembled a standard freighter hold. Emergency medical equipment lined the bulkheads, while rows of treatment pods waited to receive whatever casualties their desperate rescue operation might produce. Dr. Okafor had managed to acquire life support systems compatible with a dozen different species, though Sarah knew they would be operating at the edge of their capabilities. The ship shuddered as Webb adjusted course to intercept the Zephyrian convoy. Through the cargo bay's reinforced viewport, Sarah could see the first faint glow of the subjugator's engines as they closed the distance. The heavy cruiser was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Defiant Star, its dark hull bristling with weapon emplacements and sensor arrays. Sarah activated the medical bay's communication system and began her final preparations. "All medical stations, this is Dr. Chun. We're approximately 5 minutes from contact. I want all emergency treatment protocols ready for immediate implementation. We're going to have hundreds of casualties in various states of physical and psychological trauma, so be prepared for anything." The response came from the handful of crew members who had medical training. A former Federation medic named Harrison, a Terran colony doctor called Martinez who had fled Zephyrian occupation, and, surprisingly, Chief Nakamura, whose engineering background included extensive work with life support systems. "Medical team standing by," Harrison reported. "Emergency surgical suite is ready, and we've got trauma treatment protocols loaded for all known species types. It's going to be rough, Doc, but we'll do whatever it takes." The ship's alert klaxons began wailing as they approached weapon range of the Zephyrian convoy. Sarah strapped herself into the command chair she had installed in the medical bay, watching her instruments as the distance closed between predator and prey. On the tactical repeater, she could see the escort destroyers beginning to adjust their formation, their sensors finally detecting the approaching freighter through the nebula's interference. "This is it," Webb's voice announced over the ship-wide communication system. "All hands, prepare for combat maneuvers. Tommy, fire the EMP torpedo on my mark." Sarah held her breath as the seconds ticked by. Everything depended on the next few moments. The torpedo had to hit the subjugator's shield generators at exactly the right angle to collapse their defensive screens without triggering the ship's automatic destruct systems. Too much damage, and they would be rescuing corpses. Too little, and the cruiser's point defense systems would tear the Defiant Star apart before they could get close enough to board. "Mark," Webb said quietly. The ship lurched as the modified torpedo launched from their forward tubes, its electromagnetic payload racing toward the subjugator through the swirling clouds of the nebula. Sarah watched the tactical display, counting seconds as the weapon covered the distance between ships. Around her, the medical bay hummed with ready equipment and barely controlled tension. The EMP torpedo struck the subjugator amidships, just below the primary shield generators. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the cruiser's defensive screens flickered and collapsed, its running lights dimming as electromagnetic pulse cascaded through its primary systems. The ship continued on its previous course, but Sarah could see from the tactical display that its engines were offline and its weapon systems had gone dark. Direct hit, Vasquez shouted over the intercom. Subjugator's shields are down, and her main systems are offline. We've got maybe 2 minutes before they restore power. The Defiant Star accelerated toward the crippled cruiser, Webb pushing the modified freighter's engines beyond their rated capacity in a desperate race against time. Behind them, the escort destroyers were turning to engage, their powerful weapons beginning to charge for long-range bombardment. But they were still too far away to prevent the boarding action, and their commanders probably didn't want to risk hitting their own ship with weapons fire. Docking clamps engaging, Nakamura reported. We're attached to their primary cargo bay. I'm reading atmosphere on the other side, but it's got high concentrations of sedative gas. They've been keeping the specimens unconscious during transport. Sarah's medical training kicked in as she processed the implications. All boarding team members, make sure your breathing apparatus is sealed. That sedative gas will be lethal to humans in those concentrations. I'm reading it as a Zephyrian military-grade compound designed for long-term chemical restraint. The ship shuddered again as magnetic docking clamps locked onto the subjugator's hull. Through the cargo bay viewport, Sarah could see the cruiser's dark metal surface, scarred from countless battles and marked with Zephyrian military insignia. Somewhere beyond that armored hull were hundreds of beings who had been torn from their homes and families, reduced to experimental subjects in the Empire's endless hunger for military advantage. Boarding team go, Webb ordered. Sarah watched through the security cameras as 6 crew members in full environmental suits crossed through the docking tube into the subjugator's cargo holds. Their helmet lights cut through the murky atmosphere, revealing rows upon rows of containment units lining the cruiser's cavernous storage areas. Each unit held 1 or more beings from various species, all unconscious from the sedative gas that filled the compartment. Jesus Christ, Harrison's voice crackled over the communication system. There are hundreds of them. Kids, adults, elderly, they got whole families in here. Dr. Martinez's medical scanner readings began flowing back to Sarah's station, and what she saw made her stomach turn. The beings in the containment units weren't just unconscious, they were dying. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma, so severe that their vital signs showed the physiological markers of beings who had simply given up hope. Medical priority triage, Sarah announced over the communication system. Start with the youngest and work your way through based on survivability. We need to get them out of that contaminated atmosphere immediately. The evacuation began with desperate efficiency. Crew members carried unconscious beings through the docking tube, where Sarah and her medical team immediately began emergency treatment. The first casualties were Kithera cubs, their midnight blue fur matted and their silver eyes closed in chemical-induced unconsciousness. Sarah worked quickly to clear the sedative compounds from their systems, watching their vital signs stabilize as fresh oxygen replaced the poisoned atmosphere they had been breathing for weeks. Dr. Chun, we've got a problem. Dr. Okafor's voice cut through the medical bay's organized chaos. The escort destroyers are moving to attack position. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they're in weapons range. Sarah looked up from the Kithera cub she was treating. Not the same one she had saved on Kepler Station, but similar enough to remind her why they were taking these impossible risks. How many more do we need to evacuate? Approximately 150, Harrison reported from the subjugator's cargo bay. We're moving as fast as we can, but some of these containment units require manual override codes. The ship shook as the first long-range shots from the escort destroyers began to find their range. Webb was maneuvering the linked ships erratically, trying to use the subjugator's bulk as a shield while the evacuation continued. But Sarah knew they couldn't maintain that protection much longer. Eventually, the destroyers would get a clear shot, and the Defiant Star shields wouldn't withstand concentrated fire from military-grade weapons. All medical personnel, prepare for emergency departure, Sarah announced. We need to stabilize as many patients as possible for potential high-G maneuvers. She moved quickly through the cargo bay, checking on the beings they had already evacuated. The variety of species was staggering, not just Kithera, but representatives from dozens of worlds that had fallen under Zephyrian control. Crystalline entities whose natural luminescence had dimmed to barely perceptible glows. Melodian collective members whose empathic abilities had been damaged by prolonged isolation. Even a few humans from frontier colonies, their faces bearing the hollow expression of beings who had endured unthinkable trauma. But they were alive. Hurt, traumatized, barely clinging to existence in some cases, but alive. And that meant there was hope. Last group coming through, Martinez reported. We got everyone who was still alive. Some of the containment units, they didn't make it. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of grief for the beings they hadn't been able to save. But there would be time for mourning later. Right now, hundreds of rescued beings needed immediate medical attention, and they still had to escape from two Zephyrian destroyers that were closing in for the kill. Docking clamps disengaging, Nakamura announced. We're clear of the subjugator. The Defiant Star pulled away from the crippled cruiser just as the first spread of torpedo fire from the escort destroyers lit up the space around them. Webb threw the freighter into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible with a standard cargo load. But the modified ship responded to his commands with an agility that belied her battered appearance. All passengers, brace for emergency acceleration, Sarah announced over the medical bay's intercom. She moved quickly through the treatment areas, making sure that the rescued beings were properly secured in their emergency cradles. Many of them were still unconscious from the sedative gas, which was actually a blessing. They wouldn't be aware of the violent maneuvers necessary to escape their former captors. The ship lurched as Webb pushed the engines to their maximum output, racing for the edge of the nebula where the interference would provide cover from pursuit. Behind them, the escort destroyers gave chase, their more powerful engines gradually closing the distance despite the head start. But they had to be careful with their weapons' fire. The nebula's charged particles could cause torpedo guidance systems to malfunction, and a missed shot might detonate close enough to damage their own ships. Engine efficiency dropping to 70%, Nakamura reported. We're pushing her too hard, Captain. The modifications weren't designed for this kind of sustained stress. Sarah strapped herself into her command chair as the ship shuddered under the strain of maximum acceleration. Around her, the medical bay had become a complex orchestra of life support systems, each one calibrated to keep a different species alive during their desperate flight to freedom. The air recyclers worked overtime to process the complex mixture of atmospheres required by their diverse passenger load, while temperature and humidity controls struggled to find settings that wouldn't be lethal to any of the rescued beings. Incoming missiles, Vasquez reported. Multiple contacts closing fast. The Defiant Star twisted through a series of defensive maneuvers that sent everything not secured crashing across the cargo bay. Sarah held on to her chair as medical supplies scattered around the compartment, emergency lights flickering as power fluctuated through the ship's strained systems. One of the Kythera cubs began to stir, its silver eyes opening with confusion and terror as consciousness slowly returned. Sarah quickly moved to the cub's treatment pod, her hands gentle as she checked its vital signs. The sedative was wearing off faster than she had expected, which meant their passengers would soon be awake and aware of their terrifying situation. She made a quick decision and began preparing mild tranquilizers. Not the dangerous chemical restraints the Zephyrians had used, but gentle medications that would keep the rescued beings calm during their escape. Sarah, we need to talk. Webb's voice came over her personal communicator. Can you spare a minute? She looked around the medical bay, confirming that her team had the immediate situation under control, then made her way to the bridge. What she found there made her understand why Webb had called her away from her patients. The tactical display showed their position relative to the pursuing destroyers, and the news wasn't good. They're gaining on us, Webb said without preamble. At current rates, they'll be in optimal firing position in about 10 minutes. Our shields won't hold up to concentrated bombardment from military-grade weapons. Sarah studied the display, her scientific mind automatically calculating vectors and probabilities. What are our options? That's what I want to discuss with you, Webb said. We've got enough fuel to make it to 3 possible destinations. The Centauri Free Trade Zone would give us legal protection, but it's 18 hours away at current speed. The escorts would catch us long before we reach safety. He highlighted another star system on the display. The Tau Ceti research station is only 6 hours away, and they've got defensive platforms that might discourage pursuit. But it's run by the Terran Federation, and they'd be required to turn us over to Zephyrian authorities if formally requested. The third option made Sarah's blood run cold. The Outer Rim territories, she said, reading the designation. Uncharted space, Webb confirmed. No government, no law, no guarantee that we'd ever find our way back to civilized space. But also no extradition treaties with the Zephyrian Empire. If we can lose the destroyers in the interference fields near the galactic edge, we might be able to disappear completely. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying directly. The Outer Rim was where ships went to disappear, either by choice or because they had no other options. Pirates, refugees, political exiles, anyone who needed to vanish from galactic civilization ended up in the unmapped regions beyond the frontier. Some of them eventually found ways back to legitimate space. Many of them didn't. What do you recommend, Captain? Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical display as the red icons of their pursuers crept steadily closer. Honestly, I think our only real choice is the Outer Rim. The Federation won't protect us, and the free trade zone is too far away. But if we disappear into uncharted space, we can find somewhere to set up a base of operations. Maybe start a proper rescue network instead of just these one-off operations. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. A permanent base in the Outer Rim, dedicated to rescuing victims of Zephyrian atrocities. It would mean giving up any hope of returning to legitimate civilization, but it would also mean the ability to save thousands of beings instead of just the few hundred they had managed to evacuate today. The passengers, Sarah said. Have you told them what our options are? Not yet. I want to discuss it with you first, since you're the closest thing we have to a liaison with the rescued beings. This decision affects them as much as us. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what Webb was asking her. The Kithera and other rescued species would have to choose between repatriation to what remained of their homeworlds, if those worlds still existed, or exile in the Outer Rim with the humans who had saved them. It wasn't the kind of choice anyone should have to make. I need to talk to them, Sarah said. The ones who are conscious enough to understand the situation. They deserve to know what their options are. She returned to the medical bay, where several of the rescued beings had regained consciousness and were beginning to ask questions in a variety of languages. Sarah's universal translator worked overtime to process the complex mixture of dialects and communication methods, but the underlying message was consistent across all species: confusion, fear, and desperate hope that their nightmare was finally over. Sarah moved to the treatment pod, holding the Kithera cub she had been monitoring. Its silver eyes tracked her movement with an intelligence that still amazed her, and she could see awareness there that went far beyond simple animal consciousness. When she spoke, the cub's ears perked up, and what she had learned was a sign of careful attention. Can you understand me? Sarah asked softly. The cub's response was a series of soft chirping sounds that her translator processed into recognizable words. You saved us. The scent markers on your clothing match those of the healer who helped me during the dark time. Sarah's breath caught as she realized what the cub was saying. Its enhanced sensory abilities had detected traces of the neural stimulant she had administered back on Kepler Station. This was the same individual she had spent her last 5 credits to save, the creature whose silver eyes had convinced her to risk everything for strangers. What's your name? Sarah asked. I am Kethvel of the Brightwater Collective, the cub replied, its voice growing stronger as the last of the sedatives cleared its system. Though I suspect that designation has little meaning now that the Brightwater Collective no longer exists. The simple statement carried such profound loss that Sarah had to blink back tears. This child had not only been tortured and experimented upon, but had also lost its entire civilization. Everything it had ever known was gone, erased by the Zephyrian Empire's hunger for conquest. Kethvel, Sarah said carefully, we need to make a decision about where we go from here. We're being pursued by Zephyrian ships, and our options are limited. She explained the situation as gently as she could, watching Kethvel's ears droop as the magnitude of their predicament became clear. When she finished, the young Kithera was quiet for a long moment, its silver eyes reflecting the medical bay's emergency lighting. The Brightwater Collective had a saying, Kethvel finally said. When the waters become poisoned, the wise fish swim to new streams. I believe your Outer Rim territories might be the new streams we need to find. Other conscious passengers have been listening to the conversation, and Sarah found herself fielding questions from a dozen different species as word spread through the medical bay. The consensus, when it finally emerged, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. These beings had lost everything: their homes, their families, their entire way of life. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from starting over in uncharted space. Sarah returned to the bridge with their decision, finding Webb and his crew monitoring the steadily worsening tactical situation. The escort destroyers had closed to within optimal firing range, and it was only Webb's skillful maneuvering that had kept them from achieving target lock. "They want to try the outer rim," Sarah reported. "All of them. They'd rather take their chances in uncharted space than risk being recaptured." Webb nodded grimly. "Then, that's what we'll do. All hands, prepare for hyperspace jump to the galactic edge. We're going to disappear." The Defiant Star's navigation system plotted a course toward the galaxy's outer spiral arm, where stellar cartography became sketchy and reliable hyperspace routes gave way to dangerous, unmapped transit corridors. It was a one-way trip into the unknown, but as Sarah returned to her patients and began preparing them for the jump to hyperspace, she realized that sometimes the unknown was exactly what you needed. Behind them, the Zephyrian destroyers fired a final spread of missiles as their quarry vanished into hyperspace, but the weapons arrived seconds too late. The Defiant Star and its precious cargo of rescued beings were gone, disappeared into the vast darkness of the outer rim. And somewhere in that darkness, they would begin building something that the galaxy had never seen before. A sanctuary where the victims of imperial ambition could find safety, and where humanity's greatest weakness would prove to be its greatest strength. 3 months in the Outer Rim territories had taught Sarah-chan that the galaxy's unexplored regions held both incredible dangers and unexpected opportunities. The Defiant Star and its crew had established a base of operations on Kepler 442c, a marginally habitable world that orbital surveys suggested had been abandoned by its original inhabitants sometime in the distant past. What they found when they landed was far more complex than simple abandonment. The planet's previous occupants had been the Architects, a mysterious species that had vanished from galactic records over a millennium ago. They had left behind vast underground complexes that honeycombed the planet's crust, sophisticated technological systems that still functioned despite centuries of neglect, and, most importantly, automated defense platforms that made the world nearly impossible to approach without the proper access codes. Codes that Keth Vel had somehow been able to decipher. Sarah stood in what had once been an Architect command center, watching the young Kithra work at a control interface that seemed to respond to a combination of touch, sound, and bioelectric impulses. The silver patterns in Keth Vel's fur glowed faintly as it interfaced with the ancient technology, its enhanced neural plasticity allowing it to understand systems that had baffled human engineers. "The Architects were not unlike my people," Keth Vel explained as it worked. "They believed in harmony between different species, in creating safe spaces where the vulnerable could find protection. These facilities were designed as sanctuaries, places where refugees could rebuild their lives." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The Kithara, victims of genocidal conquest, had found salvation in technology left behind by another vanished civilization. It was as if the galaxy itself was providing them with the tools they needed to fight back against the forces that sought to destroy them. Captain Webb joined them in the command center, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who had been working 18-hour days to establish their new base. "The cargo bays are finally converted to proper medical facilities," he reported. "Dr. Martinez has the surgical suites operational, and Harrison's got the psychological counseling centers ready for the worst cases." The medical challenges of caring for 300 traumatized beings from a dozen different species had pushed Sarah and her team to their limits. Many of the rescued Kithara were suffering from what human psychology would classify as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by the unique empathic abilities of their species. The trauma wasn't just individual. It was collective, a shared wound that affected the entire group's ability to function as a social unit. "How are the integration protocols working?" Sarah asked. "Better than expected," Webb said. "The crystalline collective entities are proving particularly adaptable to the Architect systems. Something about their natural quantum consciousness allows them to interface with the base's AI networks in ways we never anticipated." That had been one of the most remarkable discoveries of their first month on Kepler 442c. The Architect technology was designed to be operated by multiple species working in harmony, with different biological and cognitive capabilities contributing to the overall system functionality. It was a philosophy of cooperation that stood in direct opposition to the Zephyrian Empire's doctrine of conquest and subjugation. Dr. Okafor appeared in the doorway, carrying a data pad filled with intelligence reports that had been transmitted by their growing network of sympathizers in civilized space. His expression was grim, which usually meant bad news from the outside galaxy. "We've got confirmation on the Vega research facility," he said without preamble. "The Zephyrians completed their experiments on the remaining Kythera specimens 3 weeks ago. All subjects terminated to prevent intelligence leaks." Kethvel's fur patterns dimmed noticeably at the news, and Sarah could see the young Kythera's ears droop with grief. The beings they had rescued were the last free members of their species. Everyone else was either dead or in Zephyrian custody. The weight of being the final remnant of an entire civilization was almost unbearable, especially for someone so young. "There's more," Okafor continued. "We're getting reports of similar operations across the frontier. The Melodian pacifist enclaves have been relocated for resource extraction. The Tausetian colony worlds are being cleared for military installations. It's not just isolated incidents anymore. It's systematic genocide on a galactic scale." Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same rage that had cost her career at the Terran Research Institute. But now, instead of being channeled into academic papers that bureaucrats would ignore, that anger had a concrete outlet. They weren't just caring for the survivors of one atrocity. They were building the infrastructure to rescue victims from dozens of similar operations. "What's our current operational capacity?" Webb asked. "The Defiant Star is fully operational again after the engine overhauls," Okafor replied. "Lieutenant Commander Vasquez has 2 additional ships ready for rescue operations. The Liberation we acquired from that Rigel arms dealer, and the Sanctuary that Captain Morris brought in from the Centauri Resistance Cell." The network was growing faster than any of them had anticipated. Word was spreading through the galaxy's underground that there was a place in the outer rim where the victims of Imperial ambition could find safety. Rogue ship captains, disgraced military officers, exiled scientists, and political refugees were making their way to Kepler 442c with increasing frequency. Each new arrival brought skills, resources, and intelligence that strengthened their operation. But they also brought new challenges. "We've got a situation developing in Bay 7. Dr. Martinez's voice crackled over the communication system. "Some kind of altercation between the Ursinoid refugees and the former Zephyrian prisoners." Sarah sighed, recognizing the symptoms of a problem they had been struggling with since the early days of the Sanctuary. Not all of their rescues were voluntary victims of Imperial aggression. Some were Zephyrian soldiers who had defected after witnessing atrocities they couldn't stomach. Others were civilian collaborators who had been discarded when they outlived their usefulness. Integrating former enemies with their victims required a delicate balance of justice and pragmatism that tested everyone's commitment to their idealistic principles. "I'll handle it," Sarah said, grabbing her medical kit. She had become the unofficial mediator for these conflicts, partly because of her xenobiological expertise, and partly because her spending her last 5 credits to save Kethvel had given her a certain moral authority among the rescued beings. Bay 7 had been converted into a general population housing area, with living spaces designed to accommodate the diverse environmental needs of their refugee population. When Sarah arrived, she found about 30 beings from various species arranged in 2 opposing groups, with clear signs of tension that could easily escalate into violence. On one side were the Ursinoid refugees, massive, bear-like beings whose homeworld had been strip-mined by Zephyrian industrial operations. Their leader, a female named Grokshaw, stood nearly 8 feet tall and had the kind of scars that came from fighting mining equipment with bear claws. Her people had been enslaved as manual laborers until a cave-in had allowed a few dozen of them to escape. Facing them were 3 former Zephyrian soldiers who had defected during the Rigel uprising, led by a junior officer named Zethkar, whose reptilian features showed the ritual scarification traditional among military personnel. They had provided intelligence that led to several successful rescue operations, but their presence remained a source of tension among beings who had suffered under Zephyrian occupation. "Dr. Chin," Grokshaw rumbled in her deep, resonant voice. "These former oppressors claimed to be reformed, but they continue to wear the marks of their military service. How can we trust beings who voluntarily participated in our enslavement?" Zethkar's response was delivered in the precise, clipped tones of military training. "We have proven our commitment to this cause through our actions. We have provided intelligence, participated in rescue operations, and accepted exile from our own people. What more evidence of sincerity do you require? Sarah could see both sides of the argument and understood why this particular conflict kept resurfacing despite their best efforts to mediate. The Ursinoids had every right to be suspicious of their former captors, while the Zephyrian defectors were genuinely trying to atone for their past actions. But trust wasn't something that could be mandated by policy. It had to be earned through consistent behavior over time. Graksha, Zethkar, Sarah said, stepping between the two groups. I understand the source of this conflict, and I respect both of your positions. But we need to find a way to work together if we're going to continue rescuing beings from the Empire. She activated her datapad, calling up the intelligence reports they had received over the past week. Right now, there are 14 active transport operations moving prisoners to various research facilities. If we can intercept even half of them, we could save close to 2,000 beings. But those operations require the kind of detailed intelligence that only someone with military experience can provide. Sarah turned to address both groups directly. I'm not asking anyone to forget the past or pretend that terrible things didn't happen. But I'm asking you to consider whether your desire for justice is more important than saving the lives of beings who are suffering right now. Kethvel appeared at Sarah's shoulder, its silver fur patterns glowing faintly in the artificial lighting. Despite its youth, the young Kithra had become something of a spiritual leader among the rescued beings, partly because of its species' natural empathic abilities, and partly because its survival story had become legendary among the refugee population. Among my people, Kethvel said in its clear, musical voice, we had a concept called redemption through service. The idea that past wrongs could be balanced by future good deeds, but only if those deeds were performed consistently and without expectation of reward. The young Kithra moved to stand between the opposing groups, its small form somehow commanding attention from beings many times its size. The former Zephyrians among us cannot undo what they have done, but they can dedicate their remaining lives to preventing similar wrongs from being committed. That dedication must be proven through actions, not words. Zethkar inclined his head respectfully. What would you have us do? There is a transport leaving the Vega system tomorrow, Kethvel said. Intelligence suggests it carries approximately 150 Melodian collective members being relocated for forced labor operations. The convoy will be heavily guarded, and success will require detailed knowledge of Zephyrian tactical doctrine. The young Kithra looked directly at the Zephyrian defectors. Lead this rescue operation. Put yourselves at risk to save beings your former comrades seek to exploit. Prove through your actions that your commitment to redemption is genuine. Sarah watched the interplay of emotions across Zethkar's scarred features as the former soldier processed the challenge. Leading a rescue operation would require him to actively fight against his former comrades, burning any possibility of returning to his old life. It was the ultimate test of his sincerity. I accept, Zethkar said finally. My unit will plan and execute the rescue operation. We will prove our commitment through our actions. Graksha studied the Zephyrian defector for a long moment, then gave a rumbling grunt that Sarah had learned was a sign of grudging approval. If you succeed in saving Melodian lives, the Ursinoid Collective will consider your past service forgiven. But know that we will be watching your every action. The tension in Bay 7 gradually dissipated as the two groups began discussing operational details for the rescue mission. Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride in what they had built here, not just a sanctuary for refugees, but a community where former enemies could work together toward common goals. It wasn't perfect, and there were still conflicts and misunderstandings, but it represented something that the galaxy's major powers had declared impossible. As she made her way back toward the medical facilities, Sarah was intercepted by Captain Webb, who wore the expression of someone bringing important news. We just received a priority transmission from our contacts in the Centauri system, he said. It's addressed specifically to you. Sarah frowned, wondering who in civilized space would be trying to contact her by name. She followed Webb to the communications center, where a holographic message was waiting for playback. When she activated the system, Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the face that materialized in front of her. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison had been Sarah's mentor at the Terran Research Institute, the woman who had guided her early career and encouraged her research into alien sociology. They hadn't spoken since Sarah's exile, and seeing her teacher's familiar features brought back a wave of nostalgia for the life she had left behind. Sarah, The holographic Morrison said, her voice carrying across 3 months of recorded delay. I hope this message finds you safe. I want you to know that not everyone at the Institute agreed with the decision to revoke your research grant. Some of us have been working quietly to document the Zephyrian atrocities you tried to expose. The message continued with details that made Sarah's heart race. A growing network of scientists, journalists, and government officials were documenting imperial crimes with the goal of presenting evidence to the Galactic Council. The political climate was shifting as more species began to understand the scope of Zephyrian ambitions. Public opinion was turning against the Empire's expansionist policies. But the most important part of Morrison's message came at the end. There's someone here who wants to speak with you, her mentor said, stepping aside to reveal another figure. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as she recognized Ambassador Tekron of the Crystalline Collective, one of the most influential diplomats in galactic politics. Dr. Chun, the ambassador's translated voice, carried the harmonic resonances characteristic of his species. Your rescue operations have not gone unnoticed by the collective. We are prepared to offer formal recognition of your sanctuary as a legitimate government entity, which would provide you with legal protections under galactic law. Sarah stared at the holographic message, trying to process what she was hearing. Legal recognition would mean that Kepler 442c could establish diplomatic relations with other governments, receive official aid shipments, and, most importantly, demand the return of their citizens if they were captured during rescue operations. It would legitimize everything they had built and provide protection for their growing population of refugees. The offer comes with conditions, Ambassador Tekron continued. You must demonstrate that your government can provide stable leadership, maintain order among diverse populations, and operate according to recognized legal principles. The collective will send observers to evaluate your community and make recommendations for formal recognition. The message ended, leaving Sarah staring at the now empty holographic projector. Webb, who had been listening from the doorway, whistled softly. Well, the captain said, looks like we're about to become a real government instead of just a bunch of pirates with principles. Sarah nodded.